Hi guys, this is Grandpa again. Good to have you joining me again. For me, it's bright and early in the morning when I'm recording this, so you'll hear me say good morning. Hey, did you know that this little town of Stillwater that this story is taking place in is Stillwater, Minnesota? It's a little town that's not very far away from where Clara and Walter live. So that's kind of interesting. If I were to ask you, do penguins lay eggs or do they give live birth, kind of like people and dogs and cats, where a baby just comes out and it's not in an egg? What do you think? And if penguins lay eggs, do they lay just one egg? What do you think? But I think we're going to find out the answer to those questions today in our story. Here we are today. We're starting chapter 12. It looks like this. And 12 is an X, which is a 10, and the I's are 1, so it says 10, 11, 12. We're on chapter 12 today, and it's called More Mouths to Feed. See what that title is all about. So the next day, Mr. Popper called an engineer and had a large freezing plant installed in the cellar and took Captain Cook and Greta down in the basement to live. Then he had the furnace taken out and moved upstairs into the living room. It looked very odd up there, but as Mrs. Popper said, it was a relief, at least, not to have to wear their coats all the time. Mr. Popper was quite worried when he found out that all these changes were going to be very expensive. The refrigerating engineer was worried too when he found out that Mr. Popper had practically no money. However, Mr. Popper promised to pay as soon as he could, and the man let him have everything on credit. It was a good thing that Mr. Popper got the penguins moved when he did, because Mrs. Popper had been right about the eggs. The rookery is the nest where the birds live. The rookery had scarcely been moved to the basement when Greta laid the first egg. 3 days later, a second one appeared. Since Mr. Popper knew that penguins laid only 2 eggs a season, he was astonished when a little later a third egg was found under Greta. Whether the change in climate had changed the penguins' breeding habits, Mr. Popper never knew, but every third day a new one would appear until there were 10 eggs in all. Wow, normally they only lay 2. Now penguin eggs are so large that the mother can sit on only 2 at one time, and this created quite a problem. Mr. Popper solved it, however, by distributing the extra eggs under hot water bottles and electric heating pads that were kept at just the penguin's body heat. Have to keep those eggs warm. Eggs have to be kept warm. They can't be in frozen conditions. Eggs will freeze, and that's not good. The penguin chicks, when they began to hatch, were not so handsomely marked as their mother and father. They were fuzzy, droll little creatures who grew at a tremendous rate. Captain Cook and Greta were kept very busy bringing food to them, though. Of course, the Poppers all helped too. And here's a picture of Captain Cook and Greta and the first little baby penguin that came out. He's all fuzzy. Mr. Popper, who had always been such a great reader, had no difficulty in thinking of names for the penguin children. They were named Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. Still, he was rather relieved when there were no more than 10 to name. Mrs. Popper, too, thought that this was about enough penguins for anybody, though they really did not make much difference to her and her housework. As long as Mr. Popper and the children remained too close, remembered to close the cellar door in the kitchen. The penguins all loved to climb the stairs that led up to the kitchen, but they never knew when to stop unless they found the kitchen door closed. Then, of course, they would turn around and toboggan back down the steps again. This made a rather curious noise sometimes when Mrs. Popper was working in the kitchen, but she got used to it, as she had gotten used to many other strange things this winter. The freezing plant that Mr. Popper had got for the penguins downstairs was a large and good one. It made very large blocks of ice instead of small ice cubes, so that soon Mr. Popper had made a sort of ice castle down there for the 12 penguins to live and to climb over. Mr. Popper also dug a large hole in the cellar floor and made a swimming and diving pool for the birds. From time to time he would throw live fish into the pool for the penguins to dive for. They found this very refreshing because, to tell the truth, they got a little tired of canned shrimp. The live fish were specially ordered and were brought all the way from the coast in tank cars and glass boxes to 432 Proudfoot Avenue. Unfortunately, they were quite expensive. It was nice that there were so many penguins, because when 2 of them, usually Nelson and Columbus, got into a fight and began to spar at each other with their flippers, the 10 other penguins would all crowd around to watch the fight, and they would all make encouraging remarks. This made for a very interesting little scene. Mr. Popper also flooded a part of the cellar floor for an ice rink, and here the penguins often drilled like a sort of small army, in fantastic marching movements and parades around the ice. The penguin Louisa seemed especially fond of leading these little marching drills. It was quite a sight to see them, after Mr. Popper had the idea of training Louisa to hold a small American flag in her beak while she proudly led the solemn parades. Janie and Bill would often bring their little friends home from school with them, and they would all go down and watch the penguins for hours. At night, instead of sitting and reading and smoking his pipe in the living room, as he had done before, Mr. Popper would put on his coat and take his things downstairs. There he would sit and read with his mittens on, looking up from time to time to see what his pets were doing. He often thought about the cold, distant regions in which these little creatures really belonged. Often, too, he thought how different his life had been before the penguins had come to keep him occupied. It was January now, and already he dreaded to think of the time when spring would come, and he would have to leave them all day and go back to painting houses again. That takes us to chapter 13. X is 10. 10, 11, 12, 13. Chapter 13. And this chapter is called Money Worries. Where is the money going to come from? There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. Papa, she said, I must talk to you. Come and sit down with me. Yes, my love, said Mr. Popper. What is on your mind? Papa, said Mrs. Popper, I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation, and I must say it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy, with you down in the basement all the time. But, Papa, what are we going to do for money? What is the trouble? Asked Mr. Popper. Well, of course, the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills are for all of those live fish? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them, and the engineer who put in the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money. Is our money all gone? Asked Mr. Popper quietly. Practically all of it. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." "Oh no, Mama," said Mr. Popper. "You don't really mean that, do you?" "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break the children's hearts, too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for a while. "I have an idea, Mama," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we could have a little money to live on." "No," said Mr. Popper. "I have a better idea. A better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of trained seals acting in theaters." "Well, of course I've heard of trained seals," answered Mrs. Popper. "I even saw some once. They balanced balls on the ends of their noses." "Very well then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, then why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you're right, Papa." "Of course I'm right. And you can help me train the penguins." The next day they had the piano moved down into the basement at one end of the ice rink. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she had married Mr. Popper. But with a little practice, she soon began to remember some of the piano pieces that she had forgotten. "What these penguins like to do the most," said Mr. Popper, "is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columbus get into a fight with each other, and to climb up the steps and toboggan down. So we will build our act around these 3 tricks." "Yeah, they don't need costumes anyway," said Mrs. Popper, looking at the droll little figures. Droll means they're kind of plain looking. "They already have a costume on." So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each different kind of act. Soon the penguins knew, from hearing the music, just what it was they were supposed to do. When they were supposed to parade like a lot of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. When the penguins were supposed to climb and toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable stepladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook. It was cold down in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn how to play the piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. And that's the end of chapter 13. Thanks for joining me again. It's a good book, and it's going to get better because it sounds like they're about to take their show on the road and go perform in theaters. We'll see how that goes. Good to see you. Take care. Bye-bye.